cross-section of Nigerians have strongly criticized President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's proposed 2026 national budget, describing it as a debt trap, especially by the ADC, disguised as a reform, they say. According to the opposition party, the budget relies heavily on excessive borrowing and unrealistic revenue projections, warning that the plan could further mortgage Nigeria's future and worsen the country's growing fiscal crisis.
The ADC argues that rather than introducing real economic reforms, the proposed budget risks deepening dependency on debt and increasing the financial burden on future generations. As the debate over the 2026 budget intensifies, questions are being raised about the government's fiscal strategy, debt management, and long-term economic vision. Joining us to unpack more of this conversation is Economist and Development Expert, Dr. Aliyu Ilias. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
All right. A great way to begin would be to get your sense of the budget. And if you agree with the ADC that this is a debt trap disguised as a reform, or those who criticize it saying that, you know, it's not really what we need right now as a nation.
Without agreeing with ADC, Nigerian budget is giving the concern, and the concern that actually get deep in 2024, 2025, and the upcoming 2020. Because you look at the level of implementation of the budget to give a concern. You also look at the component of the budget right from the capital expenditure, the debt servicing, and also the recurrent expenditure. So if you look at this component, you see, yes, we have not actually performed well. And I listened to Mr. President when he actually presented the budget. The way he spoke, as if he's not in tandem or in charge in terms of what is happening in the economy, because a lot of concern he was raising, and he was trying to have a new charge about how he made sure that the budget is implemented. He was also giving a kind of order to the Minister of Coordinating the Economy and Budget to make sure that they form the normal cycle. So I think the most bigger thing that gives us concern more is the loss of January to December budgetary system that gives us room for accountability, give room for our budget implementation, and give room for monitoring of our budget itself. Because if you look at this 2025 budget that is going on, the capital component of it is started at October, and 70% is rolled to in 2026. So if you look at that critically, you have much concern and be very, very worried about capital expenditure and capital component implementation of the Nigerian budget.
Now, Dr. Ilias, critics of Nigeria's budgeting tradition have always said that budget's okay. We seem to be having some technical issues. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Aliyu Ilias, Economist and Development Expert. Do stay with us. You're welcome back to Breakfast Central, and we're currently discussing the statement by the African Democratic Congress saying the 2026 budget by the federal government is a debt trap. And joining us for this analysis is Economist and Development Expert, Dr. Aliyu Ilias. Before we went on that break, I was going to ask you a question on the performance of our budgets. Many critics say it's mostly copy and paste, and it's not based on any research. And we hardly get a performance report on the budget of the previous year. So this is just a mere exercise, is hopeful and is not steeped in reality. How do you react to that?
Well, let's come to this current government. I think their level of fiscal discipline needs to be moved upward better so that we can actually give expected accountability. So if you look at our budget, over time, you see that we lack that level of accountability at that level. So by the time you present a new budget, you're supposed to give us holistic or reports of the last budget and tell us the percentage. Perhaps if it is 60%, you have actually achieved, because most time we actually get to hear that we have appropriate money and this is what we appropriate for, but has it been implemented? These are the challenges we actually normally have. And if you look at this year component, this year budget, component, you can see that it has seems exciting by having 26% component, allocated for our fiscal, and the capital projects, capex, and you will now be happy that yes, it's going to be implemented. But the question is that is it going to be implemented? Will there be accountability? And also, if you look at this year budget, also critically, you discover that the expected revenue is about 35 trillion. That simply means we are going to have a shortfall and going to borrow, about 24 trillion. The problem now is that if we commence January 2026, I can assure you that the recurrent expenditure will commence as of January 1st. Even if there is no money available, they will go to CBN for ways and means to actually get the money to actually commence it. If you also look at debt service is an obligation, we must actually pay our debt. Now, the only company that mostly suffer a big problem of shortfall of revenue, inavailability of revenue, even force majeure is always the capital expenditure. And if you look at that capital expenditure, that's what actually benefits the Nigerian citizen as a whole, because that's where we get social infrastructure like road, like health, like education. This is where we get all this. So we must make sure that that component is being implemented.
We must make sure that the component is implemented. But we're also told that over 1/3 of the 54.4 trillion naira total that Nigeria plans to spend does not exist, and therefore the government would have to borrow. What's your understanding of that?
Well, we cannot say it is not exist because it's a budget. What we are doing, but the budget is the proposed income and proposed expenditure. So you recall that but if you look at the budget itself, also government has proposed a lot of income, a lot of where money is going to come from. They are giving $64 dollars per barrel. All those, so they are expected income. So it is not going to be fair, or it's not economically sound to say we must have the money readily now. It's a proposed expenditure. Government must factor what comes in month by month, day by day, and totality of the year. Remember, sometimes it's not necessary that you actually meet up the 100%, but we need to have a considerable, success. That's why we can say, yes, this budget has actually performed as expected. And that is why we need them to be accountable. That before any budget, other budget cycle, they must give us reports of the past budget. But we cannot say they cannot actually get what they are looking for, because they've actually made it clear that it's going to be a deficit budget, and the expected revenue is about 35 trillion. So it's clear that we are going borrowing, but that we cannot get to that level is not true, because it's an expected income.
All right, let's talk about the realistic nature or otherwise. Critics say that this budget is based on realistic revenue projections. How credible do you find the government's revenue targets for 2026? How feasible are they, especially in light of Nigeria's oil production challenges and the tax reforms?
Right. So if you look at this government, if there's anything you must call them, which is how to actually get revenue in Nigeria beyond what we have been seeing before. So if you look at the projection, you look at it critically, that our oil sector, which is the mainstay, we've got to have a steady, level of increase in the oil production. You also agree with me that the level of the level of damage, the level of oil theft, the level of agitation has actually reduced in that area. So considerably, we are actually increasing our oil production. So if we continue to increase that oil production, I think that will be a possible one. Then if you also look at the new tax that is going to commence by January 1st, you agree with me that it's another source of government revenue, because it's also going to strengthen the coffers of the revenue. So if you ask me, I have the optimism that Nigeria government is going to get much more revenue next year. The only fear we could see is that we don't have power on the barrel per day. If you also look at the projection of naira to dollar, it's about 1,400, which is also realistic if you ask me, because if you look at what we have at the gain of the macroeconomy, you say yes, we actually sustain that going forward. So for me, I don't think revenue is the problem. I must also say this: I'm a advocate for a bigger budget, because for a country like Nigeria, if you are having 58 trillion budget, it's going to be a difficult thing for us to actually develop. But how to resource the revenue is the question. So that budget size for me is not too much. We only need to work towards it. And we have what's called fiscal discipline. Actually follow everything as expected to be and make sure that every component being released as expected. If you also look at the budget also, it also favors security because our major problem has to, we all agree that it's security. So for me, it's not too much for them if they can do the right thing. My challenge now is the level of implementation. That is National Assembly.
Exactly. Which leads me to my next question. You're speaking about implementation, you're speaking about fiscal discipline. We're presenting a 2026 budget when we don't have a performance report of the 2025 budget. What's the impact of that?
Right. So, and that's what I was about to say about the National Assembly. National Assembly is expected to hold the executive accountable. They can actually have a policy that says that if you don't give us a scorecard for the past budget, we will not approve the next budget because National Assembly sometimes they are not actually meeting up with the expectation of the Nigerians in terms of oversight function. Because if they are giving consistent oversight function from January to first quarter, that's to April, they would have given us that, okay, for what we are actually looking at, this budget is not realistic, this budget is not doing what it's supposed to do, and you have not started implementing the capital component of it. But because the oversight is not actually as expected, that's why we're actually having issues. But I must agree with you, the 2024-2025 budget is actually not what we should call a budget, because if you have a budget that is rolling over from one year to the other, it's pretty difficult for us to actually understand. And it actually have a negative impact on the economy. It also have impact on inflation, because if you look at it very well, by the time you start capital expenditure by October 2025, is going to push a lot of things to high, and it might erode the gain we have gotten in level of macroeconomy.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Ilias, you did speak to the point of the rollover of the budget, but on Friday, when Mr. President presented the budget before the National Assembly and said we'll no longer have budget rollovers, he got a huge round of applause. What do you make of this, and does the government deserve any sort of credit for making this pronouncement or decision?
And do you believe them?
Knowing that they actually started this business of rolling over budgets.
Right. For me, I took that with cautious optimism. I don't want to have, in fact, my belief for that is very, very low. Because if you have performed not credibly well as expected in budgetary implementation for 2 consecutive years, how are we sure that it's going to be well, catered to in 2026? Remember, 2026 is the election year as well. So most politicians target, how they can actually secure, their position as it comes. So for me, I have cautious optimism for that, and I don't think it's what we should be negotiating. It should be statutory. If you recall, during the Buhari regime, it was what we actually know that is going to happen between that period. And recall, the National Assembly have to work on this budget as well. So they have not even approved. I'm sure they are going to do some, implement some adjustment and what have you. And that's not even commenced as at now. So I don't have a difficult. And that's why I said I would take that with cautious optimism.
It seems to us, especially Nigerians right now, that there seems to be different explanation as regards what our tax laws are, tax system, the fiscal year. There's just way too much. And it would be nice if the federal government can put all of these things in clear perspective, possibly on a website, or maybe put out some form of information for every Nigerian to understand what it means for them. But you also have been following it, so I think the bulk will come to you right now. My next question is, what do you make of the fact that as we're going into 2026, Nigerians are not comfortable with the tax laws, especially the reform? We just talked about it with another guest, and you just mentioned it not quite long ago. Should the reform be postponed? And do you think it will do justice so that we can settle possibly well with the assembly and, of course, the executive before we roll out?
So should it be postponed? My own would be no. The answer will be no, let it commence. That's why we have room for amendment. That's why National Assembly must make sure that they are on top of their game. If we commence and there's some gray area, it can be adjusted and it can be amended. However, I think the government is not communicating as expected. You will recall that there is a particular issue that happened in this stock exchange where government said people have to pay a particular amount, and before within 3 days, the stock exchange have to suffer a lot of people withdrawing their money. It's portfolio investment. That was until the time we really actually came on board and said no, it is not going to affect your past dealing. It's going to affect going forward in January. And I expect the national orientation, the government to reassure people that this is to benefit Nigeria, not to actually bring problems. So I think the challenge now is that the communication gap, and that's what the Nigerian government must do more. We're in the age of social media, where someone will post something and who will take it hook, line, and thinker. So until government comes to actually be giving us the information without us even asking, since we are going to implement it, create a jingle around it, create an information around that. This is not going to. I recall that some people went and said that personally, two people came to me and said I should sign a reference for them. I asked, they said they want to open a new account because by January they said there's going to be a lot of problems in Nigeria. Say no, that for me to encounter two persons, having that fear. Imagine how many Nigerians are having the fear of tax. New tax law implementation. So government needs to do more. As I sensitizing people, I saw there's another advert I saw, somewhere. Government was orientating people that this is for positive, activity, positive implementation for Nigeria. Government must do more in terms of educating, sensitizing people, and giving us confidence. And all government must also be putting those information, like rightly said, on websites, on different platforms, so that we can actually access it without, going deep. A lot of people will call you and say, hey, this is what do you think? Even you have to go extra or call somebody that is in-house before you can get the explanation. It's not a good one. We must work on our communication.
All right. As usual, security would receive one of the highest allocations in the budgets. Education and health, even though education is not measuring up to what UNESCO typically prescribes in terms of what we should allocate to education here in Nigeria. But what markers can we use to track success in the various sectors that the allocations have been made for in the budget? And how can Nigerians be carried along or can follow up as well with this process and hold our leaders to account?
Right. If you look at this government budget since 2024, I noticed that they have been able to increase those budgetary allocations for I think it was even very highest last year to health, education, and security is taking the lead. Yes, it's a good one, but the problem lies in the budget release. How much have they released? That's the problem we're actually having. How much did you release among what you allocated? Because look at what is being rolled over. A lot of them are in health, a lot of them are in security, a lot of them are also in education and other social infrastructure. So that simply means that the budget allocating a higher amount is not a problem for this government, but actually, trying to implement those budgets and monitor those implementation by the National Assembly and Nigerians is the next thing that we need to do. So I think there must be a system whereby we follow the money and see how, it can actually be tracked. Because for me, allocating or budgetary allocation is not enough. We must see them, being appropriated for. We must see them being released. We must see those funds being released, and we must see it being, used for the exact project they want to use for. I think that's my concern. Budgetary allocation is not a problem. Implementation is a major problem.
Now, finally, before we let you go, Dr. Ilias, about 30% of the proposed 2026 budget will go towards servicing debt and overheads. That's quite a huge amount and percentage for a country that is developing, and you're wondering how much more will be left to go into health and developmental projects. At what point in our nationhood are we going to correct this anomaly or free up money for social investment programs and to really meet the needs of ordinary Nigerians?
Right. So my concern, let me take it from this perspective. I don't think we should do a budget that capital expenditure will not take 50% of that budget. Until we start doing that, that's when we can have the considerable development we expect. Now, talking about debt and servicing, if you look at debt service, that's eroded all what we are supposed to benefit in terms of the capital expenditure. And like I told you, it's an obligation, we must do it. So it's a serious problem that we must start correcting. And that's why we must, looking at the debt, we cannot say Nigeria should not borrow. For me, borrowing, it's not bad. It depends on what you actually need to do. We must make sure that we borrow. Is the project tied borrowing at all time? But in terms of debt servicing is actually eroding a lot of things from us. So we can do a lot of things. Government can go on debt buyback. Government can go, there's a lot of things government can do to make sure that this debt servicing can also be reduced so that we can actually have other, money for other social infrastructure. For me, I think we must do everything to reduce the level of debt and maybe reduce the debt service to an extent by actually, maybe bargaining for a long time and maybe debt buyback, different methods government can actually do. I think the debt service will do the benefits that we have accrued to capital expenditure.
Thank you so much, Economist and Development Expert, Dr. Aliyu Ilias. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you on this very important subject this morning. We do appreciate your insights. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.